The morning they told her the ridge wasn't worth the paper her deed was printed on, it was a Tuesday in late October of 1987, and the fog was sitting so low on the upper pasture that you couldn't find the fence line with both hands and a flashlight. She had driven 40 minutes to that bank in her good coat, the green wool one she kept on a wooden hanger behind the bedroom door, and she had set a hand-drawn map across the loan officer's desk, and he had looked at it the way a man looks at something he has already decided about. The ridge in question was 112 acres of what most people in that county called caprock and briar, a long sloping shelf of fractured limestone that ran northeast to southwest along the back of her property like a spine that had taken too many bad years to stand up straight. She had paid $420 an acre for it in the spring of that same year, which was cheap enough that two men at the co-op feed counter had laughed out loud when they heard, not cruel laughter, just the kind that comes when a person does something that confirms what everyone already suspected. She had 41 head of mixed breeding stock on the home place below, a good well, a decent barn, and about 90 acres of bottom ground that worked. The ridge was separate from all of that. The ridge was the thing nobody wanted. The loan officer had a yellow legal pad and a column of figures he had arrived at before she ever walked through the door, and he told her, politely and with what seemed like genuine regret, that the ridge carried no appraised agricultural value, that the soil depth tested at less than 3 inches over bedrock on every sample his office had on file, and that any improvement loan against that ground would be, in his word, imprudent. She thanked him. She drove the 40 minutes home. She did not stop at the diner, because by noon the diner would have a version of the story, and the version would have grown. And she was not ready for that yet. I want to be honest about what I know of her reasons, because I was 23 years old that fall, and still more certain than I had any right to be. And I did not understand what she was doing with that ridge any more than the loan officer did. She was my grandmother. Her name I will keep, because names belong to families and not to stories. But I will tell you what she knew that the bank did not. And I will tell you how I know it. And I will tell you what that ridge eventually gave back to every animal that walked it, because the land does not care who believes in it. It only asks whether you were paying attention. That is something she said more than once, and I have come to understand it was not a sentiment. It was a method. She had been paying attention to that ridge since she was a girl, walking it behind her father, a man who ran cattle on the same ground from 1934 until 1971, when his knees gave out, and his youngest son, my great-uncle, took the home place over. Her father had kept a notebook, not a ledger exactly, more of a working journal, a marbled composition book with a cracked spine, and a rubber band around it that had gone brittle and snapped sometime in the 1970s, held together now with a length of baling twine her father had tied himself. The handwriting inside was small and even, and written in pencil that had gone the color of old rust. Dates, weather, grass heights, water observations, gait counts, the weight of calves at weaning in certain years, and the conditions that preceded them. I will tell you about that notebook in time, because there is one line in it that made everything make sense, one line that her father had circled with a question mark and never answered, and that she spent the better part of 11 years answering for him. But I am getting ahead of myself, and this is not a story that benefits from rushing. This is a story about a dry ridge that wasn't dry, and about a woman who knew the difference between what the surface shows and what the ground holds, and about what it means to inherit not just land, but the quality of attention that someone else spent a lifetime building up. The fog lifted by mid-morning. I remember that. And she went out to walk the ridge, alone, the way she did most mornings that fall. And I watched her go from the barn door and thought she was just grieving in her own particular fashion. And I was wrong about that, the way young people are wrong, about the purposeful things that look like grief from a distance. I did not ask her about the bank meeting that day. She was not a woman who invited early questions. There was a right time to ask her things and a wrong time, and you learned which was which by getting it wrong enough times in your youth that the lesson stuck. She came in at noon, took off her boots at the door, washed her hands at the sink, and put a pan of yesterday's soup on the burner, without saying anything about the Ridge or the bank or the loan officer and his yellow legal pad. I asked her about the Upper East section, whether the late grazing cattle had come off it yet. She said they had. I asked her if she wanted me to move them to the south pasture before the ground froze hard. She said that would be fine. That was the whole conversation. I understood then that the bank meeting had not shaken her, which was more unsettling to me than if it had. When a thing shakes you, you talk. When it doesn't, it means you had already settled something in yourself before you walked into the room. And her silence told me she had decided something about that Ridge long before the loan officer made his column of figures. I had been at her place that fall for 7 weeks, helping her with the cattle work before I went back to finish my last semester, and in those 7 weeks I had walked the Ridge with her at least a dozen times. She moved slowly on it, which I had attributed to age, but watching her, I began to understand it was not age. It was the same quality of movement she used when she was reading weather. She would stop and stand at certain spots for a minute or two, looking at nothing I could identify, and then move on. She would bend down and push her fingers into the soil at the edge of rock outcroppings, where the limestone fractured and the ground dipped, and she would feel it for a moment, and then stand up and say nothing. Once she had me put my hand in the same spot, and I felt what she wanted me to feel, which was moisture, real moisture, not just the top of the ground dampness you get after a rain, but the kind that is present from below, the kind that wicks up from something that does not go dry when the surface does. I remember she watched my face to see whether I recognized it. I told her the ground felt wet for that late in the season. She said yes. That was all. At the time I thought she was pleased the soil was holding some late moisture. I would come to understand she was pleased that I had noticed something, because she was already thinking about who was going to carry this knowledge forward after her, and she was taking inventory of whether I was worth the teaching. I did not know that then. I know it now, the way you know most of the important things in retrospect, when the person who was quietly evaluating you is no longer there to ask. The Ridge sat at roughly 1,100 feet at its highest point, which was the northeast end, and dropped maybe 230 feet to the southwest corner where it met the back of the home pasture. The rock came through the soil on the upper sections in long, flat shelves, and the soil between those shelves was thin enough that you could see, in a dry August, the roots of the grasses going pale from want of water. 2 of her neighbors, one of whom ran a 300-head cow-calf operation to the north, had told her over the years that the Ridge was fit only for fence posts and regret, which is a thing people in that county said about rough ground that had beaten its previous owners. She bought it anyway. She bought it the same spring the bank told her it had no agricultural value, which means she bought it without their money, which means she had saved for it deliberately, over time, which means she had known what she intended for it long before she walked into that bank. I came to understand that the bank meeting was not a request. It was a test of what she already knew, and what she already knew had come, in part, from a line in her father's notebook that had been waiting on her since 1971. The notebook had been in a wooden crate on the second shelf of the barn's tack room, under a canvas tarp that also covered a box of old glass canning jars and a coil of galvanized wire that had gone orange with rust. I know this because she brought it into the house one evening in early November, about 10 days after the bank meeting, and set it on the kitchen table while I was finishing the supper dishes. I will own that I did not pay it proper attention at first. It looked like what it was, an old man's working record, and I was 23 and had been moving cattle and fixing fence since before the sun came up, and I was tired in the animal way of a person who has worked outside all day. She did not tell me to look at it. She made coffee, set a cup in front of me, and opened the notebook to a page near the back that she had marked with a folded piece of brown paper bag. She turned it so I could read it, and then went to sit in her chair by the window with her own coffee. I looked at the page, her father's handwriting, small, and even, as I described it, in pencil, gone to rust brown, running in careful lines across the ruled paper. It was a record of a dry summer, 1957, when he had lost 22 pounds per head on his stocker cattle between June and September, because the grass had gone to nothing on the south and east sections. He had written about the water situation, about the stock tank on the home place running to 18 inches in July, when it usually held 4 feet in a normal year. And then, near the bottom of the page, separated from the rest by a line he had drawn with a ruler, he had written this: "And I am going to give it to you the way it was written. Upper N.E. Ridge, east-facing break below the second shelf. Seep present August 14th. Ground cattle not touching south pasture water, coming up, source unknown. Check depth. Never dug." He had circled those last 2 words, "never dug," and put a question mark after them. The question mark was pressed harder into the paper than anything else on the page, the kind of pressure a man uses when he is writing down something he means to come back to and knows he might not. She had found that notebook in 1971 when she was cleaning out the barn after her father turned the place over to her brother, and she had read it, and she had thought about those 2 words for 16 years. And in the spring of 1987, she had bought the ridge. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after I read it. I put the notebook down and looked at her across the room. She was looking out the window at nothing or at the dark, which is the same thing from inside a lit room. I asked her whether she had ever found the seep. She said she had found it her first summer on the ridge. I asked her whether she had dug. She said not yet. I asked her why not. She said because digging was a commitment, and she wanted to know what she was committing to before she put a machine to it. That was the whole conversation. But it was the most she had said about the ridge in 7 weeks, and I understood she had shown me the notebook because she was ready to move toward the next part of whatever she had been planning, and she wanted me to understand the whole shape of it before I left in the spring. She began the formal investigation of the seep that November, which is a cold and particular time of year to be doing that kind of work, but she had her reasons for the timing, and I came to understand them. A seep that is present in early November, after the leaves are off and the surface evaporation has slowed, and before the ground is frozen solid, is telling you something more reliable than a seep found in April, after the snowmelt, or in July, after a heavy rain. November moisture that comes from below is not borrowed from the season. It is coming from somewhere that holds year-round. And she knew that, and she wanted to measure it in November specifically to have that kind of evidence. She had a soil probe that had belonged to her father, a simple steel rod with depth markings filed into it by hand, and a hand auger with a T-handle that she had bought used from an agricultural equipment dealer in 1974 for $11. And she had a composition notebook of her own, newer than her father's, but in the same marbled style, in which she began to record what she found. She set up a sampling grid on the northeast section of the ridge herself, on foot, using a 100-foot measuring tape and wooden stakes she had cut from trimmed fence posts and pointed with a hatchet. 9 sample points, laid out in 3 rows of 3, the center row running directly across the east-facing break her father had noted below the second shelf of limestone. She probed each point first with the steel rod, recording the depth to refusal, which is the depth at which the rod hits rock or hardpan and won't go further. On the outer 6 points, refusal came between 2.5 and 4 inches, which confirmed everything the bank's soil samples had shown and every neighbor's opinion about the ridge. Thin rock below, nothing to hold water and nothing to grow deep roots in. But on the 3 center points, the ones running across the east-facing break, refusal came at 11 inches, 16 inches, and in the middle one, the one that was directly above where the seep wetted the surface, the probe went to 22 inches before it stopped, and when she pulled it out, it came up with dark material clinging to the lower 8 inches that was not the pale gritty topsoil of the ridge surface. It was muck. Black, dense, organic muck, the the kind of material that forms over long years in a place where water sits and plant matter accumulates and decomposes without oxygen. In the middle of a cap rock ridge, in November, in the middle of a dry fall. She made me put my hand on the probe where the dark material clung, the same way she had made me put my hand in the damp soil 2 months before, and I understood she was documenting my education as carefully as she was documenting the ground. I felt it. It was cold and it smelled like the bottom of a deep pond, that particular mineral organic smell that has no equivalent in dry ground. I looked at her. She was writing in her notebook. She did not say, "Told you so," because she was not that kind of person, but she did say, "Write down what you smell, because in 10 years you might need to describe it to someone who hasn't smelled it, and that is the kind of instruction that stays with you." I left in early March of 1988 to finish my last semester, and I did not get back to her place until the following June. In those months I thought about the ridge more than I thought about most of what my professors were trying to teach me, which probably says something about the quality of both the ridge and my academic attention. When I came back in June, she had done 3 things. She had hand-dug a test pit on the center sample point, 3 feet across and down to 31 inches, which had taken her 2 days of careful work because she was 61 years old and alone, and she dug it with a short-handled spade in sections, and at 31 inches she had hit standing water, not seepage, not moisture, but actual standing water that filled the bottom of the pit to a depth of 4 inches within an hour of her breaking through. She had not told anyone about the test pit because she was not ready for the conversation that would follow, and because she had not yet answered the question her father had written in 1957, which was the question of source. She had also, in April of that year, driven to the State University Extension office and sat down with a soil scientist there, a quiet woman in her late 40s who worked in agricultural hydrology and who had spent 20 years looking at water movement through fractured limestone systems in that region. She had brought the probe samples in 2 sealed mason jars, labeled in her own handwriting with the sample point and the depth, and she had shown them to this scientist without telling her where they came from or what she suspected. The scientist had looked at the samples for a long time without saying anything. She had opened the jar with the deep center sample, the one with the muck on the lower section, and she had leaned over it and smelled it the way my grandmother had taught me to, and then she had set it on the table and been quiet for a moment, and then she had said one word. She said, "Substantial." She did not explain what she meant immediately, and my grandmother, who had excellent instincts about when not to speak, waited, and the scientist said that the organic material in that sample indicated a perched water table of meaningful depth sitting in a fractured limestone pocket, likely fed by a larger regional recharge zone to the northeast, and that if the formation extended horizontally in the way these features tended to in that geology, the quantity of water available from that seep developed properly would be, and here she paused again and chose her word carefully, exceptional. My grandmother wrote both words in her notebook, substantial, exceptional, underlined once each. She drove home and did not stop at the diner. The development of the spring, because that is what it was, a natural spring sitting in a limestone pocket at 31 inches below a ridge that everyone in the county had written off as rock and disappointment, took place over the fall and winter of 1988 and into 1989. She hired a water well contractor in October of 1988, a man who had been sinking wells in that part of the state for 30 years, and who drove a truck that had seen better days and whose opinion she trusted precisely because he never offered it unless asked. She showed him the test pit, and the sample jars, and the notebook, and the soil scientist's notes, and he walked the brake line along the second shelf 3 times in silence before he said anything, and what he said was that he had seen this formation before, twice in his career, and that both times it had proved more reliable than the drilled wells within a quarter-mile of it, and that if she developed it properly, meaning a stone and tile catch basin, dug to depth with overflow routing, and a gravity line down to the lower pasture, she would have cold water running to her stock tanks from late March through at least early December in any normal year, and in a wet year, possibly year-round. He quoted her a price of $2,340 for the full development, labor, and materials. She told him to do it. He started in the second week of October. They dug the catch basin 4 feet across and down to 44 inches, hitting the full standing water at 33 inches on a line consistent with the test pit. And the water that came up in that excavation was clear and cold, 52 degrees Fahrenheit, when the contractor checked it with his pocket thermometer, and it smelled like the deep, clean cold of the Earth's own interior, that mineral freshness that has nothing borrowed from the surface in it. The tile pipe ran 1,160 feet from the catch basin, down the ridge slope at a grade of 1 inch per 20 feet, into a concrete stock tank at the edge of the home pasture that her father had poured in 1948, and that she had never had to use in summer because the home well had always been adequate. In the spring of 1989, in the last week of April, cold, clean water began to run from the end of that tile line into her father's old concrete tank, and it ran there without a pump, without electricity, without a motor, without maintenance, on the simple authority of gravity and the patience of a woman who had been watching a ridge for the better part of 30 years. In the first summer of the spring's operation, 1989, she ran 41 head of her breeding stock on the ridge from early May through mid-October on the grasses that had recovered in the years since it had been rested, and those cattle did not lose weight in the heat of July the way cattle on dry ground do when they are walking to water twice a day. They stood closer to the tank. They rested in the shade of the limestone outcroppings. They ate well and watered well, and the work of their digestion went into weight and condition rather than into the miles of walking that dry ground cattle put on themselves between grass and water. At the October weaning, she pulled calves off those cows that were on average 61 pounds heavier at the same age than the calves she had weaned off her home pasture cows in the same year, cows with the same genetics, the same mineral program, the same care. 61 pounds per calf. At the going price that fall, that was $62 per calf in additional value. She had 41 pair on the ridge. I will let you do that arithmetic, because it is satisfying arithmetic to do, and I will tell you only that it was enough to have the total development cost returned to her in a single season's calves, with a fair amount left to carry forward. The neighbor to the north, the one who ran 300 head, and who had told her the ridge was fit only for fence posts and regret, drove past her gate in October while she was loading the weaned calves onto a trailer for market. He slowed his truck, which was cleaner than it had any right to be for a working operation, and he rolled down his window and watched her work for a moment. He said, "Those are big calves for ridge country." She said they had access to good water. He nodded once, slowly, in the way a man nods when he is revising an opinion, but would prefer not to announce it, and he drove on. That was the whole conversation. I have thought about it many times. There is a kind of vindication that comes in a single sentence from a man who was certain you were wrong, and it is quieter and more durable than any triumphant scene, and it is, I think, the only kind worth having. The spring ran every year after that. In 1994 it ran clear through December 14th, later than any previous year, and in 2001, which was an exceptionally wet year, it ran without interruption from March through the following February, 11.5 months of free cold water on a ridge that the bank had told her was worth nothing at all. She tracked every date in her notebook the way her father had tracked the dry summer of 1957, in small, even pencil strokes on ruled paper, building a record for whoever came after her. She never had occasion to go back to that bank for a loan against the ridge, She had no need to. The ridge was paying for itself in a language that loan officers can eventually read, even if they cannot read the language the land speaks first. I am in my late 50s now, and I have the notebook. Both of them, her father's and hers, sitting on the same shelf in my own barn in a wooden crate that I built for them specifically, because I understood what they were worth in a way I could not have understood at 23. Her notebook ends in 2003, which was the last spring she walked the ridge herself, and the final entry is a date and a water temperature and a single sentence. Ran clear, 51 degrees, good color, the same as the first year. She was 76. I took over the management of the place in 2004, and I have run cattle on the ridge every summer since, and the spring has not failed me once in those 20-some years, and the calves that come off that ridge still wean heavier than the calves off the irrigated bottom ground, not every year, and not by the same margin, but reliably and over time, which is the only way the land keeps score. I have had other loan officers look at that ridge in the years since. Some of them have gotten better at reading it. Most of them still see Caprock and Briar first and only shift their opinion when I show them the numbers, which is all right. That is what numbers are for. What I want to say, and what I want to say plainly, is that the value in that ridge was not put there by my grandmother or by her work, or even by the development of the spring. It was there before any of us. It was there when her father walked it in the dry summer of 1957, and wrote down what he saw and pressed his pencil hard into the paper when he wrote the thing he had not yet answered. It was there when she was a girl walking behind him, learning to stop and feel the ground, and smell the probe, and notice the cattle that were not walking to the south pasture water because they had already watered somewhere else. The difference between that ridge being worth nothing and being worth 41 better calves every fall was not money or machinery or credentials. It was attention. Sustained, inherited, patient attention applied to a question that had been circled in pencil for 30 years. My grandmother used to say the field doesn't care who believes in it, and I think what she meant is that the value is not contingent on being recognized. It will sit there in the dark of the ground, cold and clear and patient, for as long as it takes for someone to pay attention. She paid attention. Her father paid attention before her. I try to pay attention now, and on the mornings when I do it right, when I slow down enough to feel the ground and smell the probe and watch where the cattle are choosing to stand, I am in a conversation that goes back past either of them to the ridge itself, which has been speaking all along and asking only for the quality of hearing it deserves. I think about the loan officer and his yellow legal pad sometimes, not with bitterness, because bitterness is a waste of good thinking, but with a kind of curiosity about what it would have cost him to be right. Less, probably, than it cost him to be certain. The ridge didn't need him to believe in it. It needed one woman in a green wool coat to drive 40 minutes home and go back out walking. If you have a piece of ground that someone has told you is past using, or an old tool, or a method, or an animal that the modern version has supposedly made obsolete, I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments below. Not because I have answers for every piece of stubborn ground, but because the conversation between people who are paying that kind of attention is worth having, and there is not nearly enough of it happening in places where loan officers with yellow legal pads can hear it. Subscribe if this meant something to you. There is more where this came from, and we move slow on this channel, but I believe we get there.